Salam, hello, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Sahar Halamzai, and I'm a writer, activist, and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'm very excited to be welcoming you to this event. It is the first in a series which I've been developing with my colleague Marika Theros, who's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a researcher. This is part of the Atlantic Council's strategic dialogues on and with Afghanistan. More details on this work can be found on the South Asia Center site. Today's event will explore the political nature of research and knowledge production in Afghanistan. We will look at how this shapes narratives, processes, and outcomes, and look towards more collaborative and inclusive methods that can help produce better research that combines knowledge and helps mitigate some of the ethical issues that arise in conducting research in places like Afghanistan. In conflict-affected contexts, information environments are fragmented and complex. Information is partial, politicized, and valuable. One's research can shape policies and practices and structure whose ideas are promoted or suppressed. This makes it imperative for all scholars and researchers, whether in Afghanistan or outside, to recognize how research involves making political and ethical choices about whose voices are heard and whose knowledge counts. We're delighted to welcome such a distinguished panel of experts to this discussion who will guide us through some of these questions, as well as a wonderful moderator, Musqa Dastoger. Musqa is a political scientist and specializes in peace and security. She's a lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul, as well as a special advisor for the Joint Task Force for Anti- and Counter-Corruption. She also holds degrees from the University of Oxford and the University of Copenhagen. In a few moments, I'll hand over to Musqa, but a few housekeeping points first. The first part of this event will be a moderated discussion, followed by a Q&A. Please do use the chat function on Zoom to ask your questions, and we will try to get through as many of them as we can. Finally, I wanted to thank the Atlantic Council South Asia Center for their continued support, and in particular, its Associate Director, Harris Samad, and civil society expert Makfi Azizi. Musqa, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Sahar. So I just want to briefly frame the conversation that we're going to be having today, why it's important and why specifically for Afghanistan right now. Politics of knowledge production sounds abstract, but it essentially just has to do with the political choices about whose knowledge counts, whose voices and perspectives matter and can inform political level deliberation and outcomes at the level of practice. In other words, research, scholarship, policy analysis, analytical strategies are locations where power operates. They are not sites of neutral truth. Any given theory or theoretical approach is a heuristic. Any data point is part of a bigger picture. Positionality matters. So the questions that are relevant to ask are not just who conducts research, but also who funds it. What is the political context and what political ideas bleed into the way questions are framed? What assumptions about the subject underlie the design of the research strategy? So while the politics of knowledge production may sound abstract, the implications are very real, very practical, whose voices and perspectives can inform not just policy making, but in the first instance, the discursive forces that demarcate the field of possibility for that policy making. And with that, the outcomes of political processes and also the dissemination of resources. So there is a political economy angle to it as well. But the necessity of initiating this conversation in the context of Afghanistan right now derives not just from an intellectual level conviction that it is right and justified and makes sense. It also comes down to a sense of powerlessness. Not having our voices and perspectives taken into account puts Afghans in danger of losing political control of our own destiny again. Further to that, a lot of research on Afghanistan tends to be produced on the terms of donors, what they deem to be relevant areas of research, relevant programs of research and agendas. Now, it's key to note here that many donors subscribe to a specific doctrine of development, a specific peace-building paradigm for which Afghanistan has become a site of implementation. We find here specific beliefs and theories of change, of how a stable society comes about. And underlying these ideas is a claim about universal viability, universal applicability. When these ideas, reproduced in the scholarship of non-Afghan scholars as well as interventions, take on an imposing role, it leaves very little scope for competing local ideas to gain traction. These are more likely to find expression in the work of Afghan scholars and researchers. So, although we are highlighting the issue of representation as far as expertise goes and the politics of knowledge production today, know that the issue is larger. It impinges on the greater context of peace building in Afghanistan, of finding a viable path out of our current circumstances. I think that suffices as framing. I think we're all mindful of the stakes at play. And on that note, I want to finally introduce our esteemed panelists. We have with us today Dr. Orzula Nemat. Dr. Nemat is an internationally known Afghan activist and scholar. She holds a PhD in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS in London. She's one of the leading experts in political ethnography of Afghanistan. One of the few women currently in the field, Dr. Nemat has led efforts to amplify marginalized voices through educational programs, building schools, protection of female victims of violence, and peace building for children. She has served on the board of various development organizations and has represented Afghan voices at various national and international conferences. After teaching international development courses at SOAS, Dr. Nemat returned to Kabul, where she briefly worked as the president's advisor on subnational governance. Since November 2016, she has been leading one of Afghanistan's most prestigious independent think tanks, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. I hope we have Obaid Ali with us. If not, we will have him with us soon. He is the current country director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network and has been with the organization since 2010. Obaid is a longtime expert on Afghan politics and on militancy and insurgency, including work on the Taliban and other foreign militant groups in the country. Before his career with the Afghanistan Analysts Network, he worked as a researcher with the EU mission in Afghanistan, focusing on the reintegration and reconciliation of the Taliban. We also have Bashir Safi with us. Bashir is a former senior advisor to the Afghan National Security Council and previously served as advisor for public affairs and information operations with the US Department of Defense in Afghanistan. He's currently pursuing a PhD in national security policy at Helms School of Government. He's an expert on counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, threat assessment, misinformation, and propaganda in conflict zones. Finally, we have Mariam Safi with us. Mariam is the founding director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, DROPS, an independent and multidisciplinary policy-oriented research institute based in Kabul. She's also the co-founder of the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, which is a transfer mechanism for civil society voices in Track 1, aimed at making the peace process more inclusive and thereby more sustainable. She's an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan and brings over a decade of research, strategy building, and leadership experience working and engaging with the UN, the European Union, NATO, think tanks, and academic institutions in Central and South Asia, Europe, and North America. Mariam recently designed and led the first comprehensive study by an Afghan think tank on the prospects for integrating Afghanistan into China's Belt and Road Initiative for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. She also most recently designed a comprehensive technology initiative at DROPS called Vishnau that allows for the collection of over 4,000 Afghan women's voices on key issues linked to the peace negotiations on a monthly basis from 16 provinces using 3 tech-based methodological approaches with the aim of ensuring women's concerns and demands from the subnational level reach negotiations reach negotiators and stakeholders. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your time today. So the first question I want to ask is for Dr. Namat. You have been involved in research production, policymaking, and advisory work for almost 2 decades. Can you please tell us about your experience as an Afghan and if this space has evolved? Are the voices and expertise of Afghans more reflected now after almost 20 years of global engagement? And how would you like to see the space continue to evolve?
Thank you very much, Muskajan. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. It's one of those enthusiastic subjects and topics that often goes beyond the traditional talks for me personally, you know, focusing on the peace process and what's happening now. I'm really, really appreciative of this excellent initiative, and I would like that such conversations continue to happen to build further on these very critical and important topics. I would like to start by very briefly sharing an overview of what type of knowledge are we talking about, then answer the question, Muska. So in general, we have to sort of follow the assumption or an understanding that knowledge is power. Having knowledge is one sort of power, and not having knowledge is another sort of power or lack of power that people are facing with. And also selective knowledge is an issue here as well that we have to keep in mind. There are typically or traditionally 3 different sort of modes of knowledge, if we can say. The traditional one, which is very scientific and scientific approaches, where academics are coming to the fields to examine a theory and go and report based on those results. There is also another mode that is being spoken about, which is more contextual or experience-based, and that is also a kind of a knowledge that is oriented most on what is the reality on the ground, as opposed to going too much theoretical. In the recent years and in the later years, also about knowledge production, we are facing with something more interdisciplinary, where theory and practice are taken into consideration, and they look into ways of building through, you know, most innovative and diverse forms of methodologies to bring things in a more richer understanding, whether at the individual, organizational, or systemic basis. So I think this is important for our conversation to understand, like, what kind of knowledge are we talking about. Now, coming to you a question and specifically looking at Afghanistan, like mentioned by Ms. Halimzai and yourself, I think it's important to note for most of your audience that speaking about a country that has been for 4 decades in war, in conflict, it's very natural that the knowledge production process is also affected by this context. Who produces what for what reason? And over the past 40 years, if we can have a very quick overview of how knowledge is being produced, we are immediately reminded by forms of selective knowledge being produced to mobilize Afghans in the anti-Soviet wars, for example. The specific Qisahani-based interpretation of our holy book, the Holy Quran, with more conversations about jihad and shahadat, you know, the anti-occupation war and martyrdom, are things that are produced in a specific way in massive scales to mobilize people who are strong believers, a country with majority Muslims, strong believers, traditionalists, to mobilize them about jihad and about resistance and martyrdom. And these are kind of literature, these are kind of knowledge that my generation were brought up with, to just be ready for shahadat in defense of your country, for example. We know that this is also happening now with the certain parts of the population, sadly, speaking of Taliban and so forth. That is a selective form of knowledge that is being produced. Moreover, in the same period of war, the beginning of war, we are also facing with a form of knowledge that are sometimes not necessarily in this way politically motivated, but in some other ways also politically motivated, are curriculums that are produced for refugees with international institution sponsorship. These are curriculums or books talking about the guns, and again the same things about children. So it's a systematic way of ideological and also intellectual way of sharing knowledge in a specific direction to mobilize the population in one way or another. Having said about this, the form of resistance-based knowledge, or the form of independent knowledge, has also taken shape in this period. By examples of which that comes to mind is Professor Majro, the Afghan well-known philosopher who unfortunately was assassinated in Peshawar, who reflects on this fascinating piece about self-dragon, using symbolism to explain the situation, to explain the context, and also to share a form of knowledge that even sharing of that very sort of a sane type of a knowledge is resulting or affecting his own personal safety and ending to his assassination as one of the many probably other factors. So in the context of war, violence, conflict, intervention, massive interventionist situation, we've seen that in Afghanistan, different forms of knowledge has been produced by different categories of people for specific purposes. So the questions of when, by whom, and for whom are really topics or questions that we have to sort of raise when we look at a piece of information that we read. And certainly external dependencies, whether at the regional level or beyond the region, has in one way contributed to better understanding of things and to better access to knowledge. In other ways, it also created more challenges and problems. For example, thanks to the massive international support in terms of educational system, higher educational system, we can see that now in a very slow, in an extremely gradual way, the level of knowledge and understanding is changing among the young Afghans in comparison to 20 years ago. And of course, the role of technology here is really critical and has to be also noted in terms of people's access to unlimited resources online that builds the knowledge. So maybe now when somebody is directly motivated on certain line of knowledge production would not be motivated fully because they will have access to alternative forms of knowledge that exist. Now, I probably will take a few moments to speak about the experiences specifically of the organization I lead, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. One really strong source of knowledge, but as Muskajan, you've mentioned, in Afghanistan, donor-driven knowledge production has also been an issue. One unique thing that makes ARU very specific is that throughout its history, in most cases, ARU's research agenda were not entirely donor-driven. They were donor-funded without any doubt, but they were shaped as a result of a very thorough consultations with community, with policymakers in the government, and with donors, and also with scholars who were involved in these processes. So within this very extreme context of knowledge being sort of exploited by different parties, by different forces for different purposes, ARU very gradually and slowly emerged as slowly as an organization that leads its own research agenda and produces a form of knowledge that brings, and it's more related to that third mode of knowledge that I was talking about, which brings the scholarship work, the experience or the field research, the importance that we give to evidence, resources and field research, and then creates a form of knowledge that is accessible to academia, to policymakers and decision makers who are dealing with real life matters, and also is something that could be hopefully in future considered as a historical contribution of the time and place that we are studying. Now, I take a few, I don't know how much time I have, but a few moments to also reflect on the not producers side of the issue as well. Here we have faced, and we have seen, probably ARU is not unique in this, throughout the country, and similar countries probably has the same experience, is that the knowledge production or the process becomes very extractive and in cases exploitive. We are all familiar, if we are honest with each other, of the instances and cases that in Afghanistan, local field data gatherers or data extractors, if we can call them, are hired to go conduct interviews, gather data. Based on these data, our international scholars have produced their pieces of knowledge, published in journals, published as books, published as articles, and led the policies towards Afghanistan back in some ways without a full or deserving acknowledgement of those people on the ground who take the risks, who are the original sources of knowledge. We have seen that happening in an exploitive way for a long time, but one good news is that it's gradually changing. We are seeing more Afghans on the leadership part of these sort of different experiences of knowledge production, or at least joining as co-authors or joining as people who are fully acknowledged and recognized in this process. I think the way forward to us is to really see more examples of ways in which we can provide more opportunities for Afghans to take the lead and to be able to bring that specific form of knowledge that they have into these global or international circles to provide more sort of experience or more space for knowledge sharing. So I will end here and then probably come back later on more points. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Dr. Namat. So rich and so panoramic, and you really spoke to some of the crucial points that will come up later as well. So we can return to them. I don't think Obaid is with us, so I'm gonna go to Bashir. I have a question for you, Bashir. Your expertise is crucial given the reality on the ground in Afghanistan and the region. Your expertise, as well as your lived experience of violence at the hands of extremists, brings so much to the table on this issue. How can such experiences and research help shape better policies on the ground? And also, a second question, can you tell us a little bit about the process of policymaking?
Thank you, Professor Mosca. Good morning, everyone, and of course, good evening to those joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan. I'd like to thank Atlantic Council South Asia Center for hosting this amazing event. This is really a great conversation, and I can say first of its kind. Before we talk about Afghan version of story, our expertise and our experience in research, we need to understand the process of knowledge production in the context of conflict in Afghanistan. The knowledge before it shapes as a narrative goes through a three-step process in Afghanistan. How this knowledge is created, how this knowledge is distributed, and how this knowledge is used. In the first step, we do not have any problem with creating our own knowledge space. As Dr. Urzala pointed, we have best researchers, we have best civil society organizations, we have best experience. We understand the conflict in and out, and we fully understand this conflict's political, social, religious dynamics. So creating data and research is not a problem for us. Our problems start with the second step, and with the very people that are leading the process. If we talk specifically about the peace process, in the monopoly of information, they exploit this monopoly of information for their own good. They do not want to listen to the Afghan stories. They don't listen to the Afghan women leadership, which is very important. They don't talk with victims. They don't talk with political circles, and even the data, the authentic data in research productions coming from Afghanistan, from the grassroots and from the district, they are somehow changed for their own political in other agendas. If we are fully engaged, if Afghan research and Afghan data is presented, that will potentially change the outcome of whatever policy they're designing for the future of this conflict. So our data in our research in Afghan voices, they are blocked, they are suppressed, and that's why we are not able to go to the to pass through these steps to go to the decision making tables. Um, in the conflicts, we understand the narratives and the opinions. They are contested. They are not neutral by default, but you get all the narratives. You get your narrative uh, from Taliban, from Pakistan, from other interested parties to the conflict, and you also have this narrative in our voice in what people of Afghanistan says about this process. You negotiate the narratives, and then you decide for the future of country. This is at the end of the day, this is Afghan conflict, and if our research, our data, and our voice is not there, I don't think this process is going anywhere. In until this very grassroots. I mean, in Afghanistan, the religious leaders, the women's leaders, the civil societies, their voice is very important. If they are not present across the table with the Taliban in any process, everything will be dead ended, as we have seen in the past. Uh, so in the knowledge negotiation, we also understand if we have narratives from all groups of the conflict, we understand each group's red lines. We understand their values, the things that they are willing to sacrifice for, and the things they're willing to compromise with. So as of now, in the whole knowledge production process of the Afghan conflict, the first thing is our data is not there, our presence is not there, and even if our data is coming, they are interpreted for their own goals, for other people's benefits, and until we do not ensure our real voice is not there on the table, I don't think this process is going anywhere. And why this knowledge is very important, because we have seen other people they speak on our behalf, and we have seen. I mean, this is really great conversation and great event. But if we see any discussions, any research, anything that are on Afghanistan, you will not see any Afghan expert on that. Other people they speak on our behalf, and this is like the blockage of information from Afghanistan is a big problem with this blockage or exploitation of data from Afghanistan. The process is not going anywhere, and this is as I said before. At the end of the day, this is Afghanistan's fate. We will be ultimately we own the responsibility, but we will be ultimately taking the human and financial cost for this. So we'll talk more about the responsibilities of what we can do and what internationals can do later. But for right now, this was I explained the process of how this knowledge space is created in Afghanistan, and how this is blocked, and who exploit the information and data coming from Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Bashir. Thank you. Yes, we will come back to some of those aspects later. I want to take the opportunity to ask Mariam. You've been involved in the peace process. You serve as a bridge between Afghan civil society and the Track 1 process. What are some of the challenges in ensuring that that the work that you're doing reflects the real views of Afghans from a grassroots and gender perspective?
Thank you, Ms. Qadhan, for that question. Wonderful to be here at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. And I agree with the other distinguished panelists that I think the timing of this webinar is so important, because the question of whose voices matters, real voices versus fake voices, has been one of the most frustrating aspects of this last few years as the peace process has started to gain rapid movement. As Dr. Nemat mentioned earlier, that knowledge production has been deeply impacted by the 4 decades of conflict. And Mr. Bashir Safi also pointed at how this production at times doesn't include an Afghan lens behind it. In the process, in the peace process, in the last, let's say the last 3 years in particular, this process of not so much the knowledge production, but then how that knowledge, as Mr. Safi mentioned, is then distributed. And as Ms. Halim Zai and yourself mentioned, who uses it, how they use it, and the politicization of these views. This has what has created, I think, immense frustration here among civil society actors, and I think the research community as a whole. The bridge that you're referring to in your question is the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace. AMIP itself, just to give you a little bit of brief of what AMIP does, its objectives, is a technical mechanism to make the peace process significantly more inclusive. It does this by acting as an interface that bridges the Track 1 negotiations and the rest of the Afghan population. And by that, I mean civil society actors and Track 3 grassroots actors in a very structured, systematic, and nonpartisan manner. Now, AMIP's aim is to make sure that critical information and public sentiment analysis on important issues raised at the table, raised by civil society actors, and raised by the public are transferred to the Track 1 negotiators to enable Track 2 and Track 3 and the socio-political cleavages to have their voices heard in the negotiation room. The mechanism also acts as a feedback loop to provide information about the negotiations to the public. This is to make the peace process more accessible and also more understandable to the wider Afghan population. Now, AMIP is mandated to receive and coordinate all inputs from the various consultations that take place nationally and or at the subnational level, as well as within the various diaspora groups. These inputs could be with regards to the various agenda points being discussed in the negotiations, a mapping of the various positions, sentiment analysis, or joint action plans, could be on the economy, develop, social norms, women's rights, truth-telling, and many more, to then be transferred to the Track 1 negotiators. Now, I would like to note here that AMIP, because oftentimes this gets a little bit confused, that AMIP itself is not an NGO and it does not do advocacy. It is a transfer mechanism that was created by a consortium of civil society organizations, DROPS, the TLO, the liaison office, and AREU. Now, first of all, coming into the discussion of the real views. Now, I find that term extremely problematic, as you all touched upon that in your points earlier. All views are real, and they all are reflective of local sentiments. Stakeholders involved in the Track 1 will evidently politicize local views and sentiments, meaning each takes into consideration that segment of views which supports their mandate as the real voices, while rejecting the rest as unrepresentative. Now, this is problematic in itself, but parties in a peace process often try to find alignments to these different voices, and they try to delegitimize those that don't match those alignments or those mandates. Now, this becomes even more problematic when such categorizations then transform into narratives, and we've seen that play out in the Afghan peace process. The question for me necessarily is not whose voices are real or not, but how we balance these diverse views. At times you have one group supporting one set of views and another supporting another set of views. And since ultimately in a peace process, all views must be reflected at the table to make an eventual peace agreement sustainable, we have to ensure that all of these views are heard. And this requires struggling and fighting against these narratives, against these categorizations, and against these politicization of voices, or whose voices matters and whose doesn't. Third, The concept of inclusivity itself is quite complex and highly difficult to deconstruct, and also problematic. So every voice can be heard. If I can talk specifically with regards to the track 1 table based on our experiences, every voice can be heard on the table, but then not everyone can sit on the table. So that's one when we're talking about inclusivity. But then again, ensuring that all voices are heard is a challenge as well, as it is near impossible to ensure that every individual's voice on the ground is at the table. But this could come about in an eventual peace agreement if it's put to the population for a referendum. At that point, that element could be addressed to the greatest extent possible. Now, what makes AMIP's work important, in my opinion, is that it can, in a systematic way, bring as many voices as possible through civil society actors in the track 2 and the track 3, as well as through its regional nodes, so they are heard at the table. Thus, even if all Afghans are not physically present, their voices should be. And in this process, AMIP uses a pluralistic approach. So where we can have a number of groups, including from the informal sector, like community elders, religious scholars, grassroots movements, to mention a few, all of whom may not have the same views necessarily, but they come together to develop a set of common and agreed positions. And then those positions get transferred to the table. Also, just very recently on Monday, just this past Monday, we held a national peace gathering. I think that's a good example to try to frame what I'm trying to say here. We brought together over 1,300 civil society actors, half from the districts and the provinces, the remaining also track 2 actors in Kabul, who came together to support a set of common demands. Now, some there supported Taliban negotiating team, some the Republic, some who didn't support any of the views held by the parties at the table. But nevertheless, they came together and they were able to discuss and find and agree on a set of common issues that they all can stand behind. So what we try to do at AMIP is to ensure that the criteria for the selection of civil society actors in such events, or whether in our own consultations that we do, is done in the most comprehensive manner as possible. And that can only be ensured by always conducting it through civil society organizations and civil society partners at the track 2 and at the track 3. So the challenges are certainly there, and there's no single formula to address these concerns as they are too fluid, and they change as the narratives change, as the stances in the peace process change, as the stages of the peace process evolve. And thus, in my experiences with AMIP, what I've realized is that you have to evolve with it as it moves. It's a fast-paced process. Civil society, as one of the greatest achievements of the last 2 decades, is also quite vast. And track 3 actors are even larger. So, and neither of them, whether track 2 or track 3, is given the luxury of time right now, nor the space. And within these constraints, as a bridge between track 1 and Afghan society, we try our best to transfer consistently and systematically as many voices from as diverse sectors as possible through our channels with the track 1 actors on the table. So with that, I will end my talking points, and if there's any question, I'd be happy to answer that. Thank you, Muska.
Thank you so much. I just have one question. You know, you are talking about civil society organizations as a conduit, and it's a really fascinating idea of how you how this multitude of voices you can get transferred to the negotiating table somehow, the perspectives expressed there. How exactly is that done, though? How does that transfer take place? Like, how do you take that multitude of voices and just sort of segmented or how do you transfer that to the negotiating table, like that multitude of voices or that multitude of perspectives? Sorry,
there's 2 aspects to that. One is more technical. So AMIP has a memorandum of understanding with the Republic negotiating team and is also in deep discussions with the Taliban negotiating team. So those tracks, those channels are where we've got focal points that we transfer these voices back to. And not only do we transfer the voices, but we also have a feedback loop in AMIP, where we then, after transferring these views, hold an event. It has been virtual because the negotiating teams are in Doha, where then the negotiating teams have to tell that stakeholder, civil society actors, how they plan on using those views and their perspectives on the views that are going to them. So that feedback loop is also there. Now, in terms of consolidating this massive amount of perspectives is an incredibly difficult feat to do. So one of the things that we do in terms of trying to consolidate the views, and let's just say in terms of our consultations, when we are inviting civil society actors for events, let's say the Monday event, when we set a criteria for our track 2 and track 3 actors, and we work with the civil society organizations to help identify associations, to networks, organizations to us, the criteria is, one of the ways we can do it is by bringing associations that are networks, because networks represent large constituencies. Or in the track 3, bringing in community elders from the district level, from the provincial level, from the village level, who can represent or who can then transfer your views also back to the population in a much wider perspective. So it's bringing individuals that are bringing institutions, formal and informal, that have large constituencies. Because if you were to represent every single view or every single voice, that would mean every single individual would have to be present. And that's impossible to do. So one of the criteria is to bring in networks, umbrella associations, those who have influence in their communities. So that's one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it in our consultations is that DROPS AMIP has 7 regional nodes. So we have partner organizations in the 7 zones of Afghanistan, 8 being in Kabul. These zones are basically a subnational level arm for us in reaching out to that entire zone. So we were conducting ceasefire consultations very recently. So we reach out to our regional nodes, who then are able to reach out to the provinces that are around them in that zone to try to gather civil society and track 3 civil society voices. Now, once again, I want to mention that it's not that I'm not saying by any means that AMIP represents or is able to collect all the voices of civil society actors. As I said, that is an extremely difficult challenge. But our goal is to try to get as close to that as possible. And not only to get as close to it as possible, but to also do it extremely fast.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry to linger with you a little longer. I want to ask you another follow-up question. You have led the way in addressing and connecting research and policymaking. You've also focused on increasing women's voices in policy discourse through the Women and Policy Journal. Can you tell us about the importance in creating a positive space for women researchers and ensuring that their expertise is brought into policy discourses?
Absolutely. Our Women in Public Policy Journal, which we started in 2014 at DROPS, one of the reasons why I started that journal is also one of the reasons why I actually started DROPS. 2 things that I noticed were huge gaps here in Afghanistan amongst the research community. One, the gap between, or the bridge between policymakers and evidence-based research or policy-oriented research was incredibly wide. Now, this happens in all contexts, and ours was no exception to that case, but even more complicated because of our experience with conflict. So there's a huge gap. The second was that the research that was being produced in Afghanistan was missing a gender lens completely. Women were often the objects of research. They were not the lens behind it. So to be able to plug those 2 gaps in particular, I started DROPS. And then to practically put this into play, we started the Women in Public Policy Journal. And it was basically, 1, to empower and hone the skills of women in policy-based research, evidence-based research, critical analysis, critical thinking. And we do that by providing them 12 months of training and evidence-based research. And then we give them the platform of the journal to write their 2,500 word paper, which takes them a whole year of training to be able to prepare. And then we have that published in the journal. And when we publish it in the journal, we have an advocacy component attached to it. And that advocacy component is meant to illustrate to the authors that the work that they do, which all ends in policy recommendations, are extremely important because they are the recipients of the policies that are developed in the government, and B, to show them how powerful evidence-based research can be in getting their views across as one additional means for them to be able to advocate their demands, their wants, and how they see Afghanistan. And this also plugs that gap that Mr. Bashir Safi also mentioned earlier. We wanted to produce knowledge that was basically developed, formulated, structured by Afghan women based right here in Afghanistan. And so it was to empower, it was to create that space, and it was to give them tools that they could use far beyond the process of the journal. And so in doing that, we have faced several challenges. Two that I'd like to still point out to you that remain. One, the gap between policy-based research and policymakers has narrowed in the last, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years, but at an extremely slow pace. The problem is that policymakers don't consult research organizations based in Kabul. They don't consult locally produced research. It's sort of like a bubble, and the knowledge that they have within that bubble that is oftentimes produced by them is what they tend to use more often. And so while we try to advocate this research and ready-made policies and recommendations, it's not taken. It's symbolically accepted. You're symbolically congratulated, but at the end of the day, it still remains on a shelf. And I think that for us at Drops, for instance, we know that there was going to be no quick fix. We knew that we weren't going to see a change over a year's time or one journal. We are now in our 7th journal, and I must tell you, Muskajan, that only this year I'm starting to recognize that at least civil society in Afghanistan is recognizing the importance of the journal. Policymakers, we still have a long way to go. I think it will take many years to be able to bridge this gap. But I think the key lies in consistency, in continuing to produce, continuing to push. And from the changes that I've seen, I think that that's very much a possibility. And more importantly than anything, I've seen that the young women that we have been privileged to work with in our journal oftentimes use those skills in their professions and in other work that they get involved in, which is also quite encouraging for us to see. But those are the serious challenges. And if I may say, one last challenge that I notice is that the youth in Afghanistan, because of the 2 decades of state building and more or less Western blueprints for how democratization is conducted, and what comes with that, even empowerment, even women's empowerment in that sphere. These 2 decades have sort of how can I say, influenced youth to expect quick fixes and quick results. And so everything, because trainings have been ad hoc, parachute projects, short-term initiatives. So short-term initiatives with a quick output is what I feel that many of our youth are used to. And therefore, when we engage them in a 12-month process in the development of a journal, a lot of my almost half tend to fall out in midway in the journal development process, because it's so detailed and it's so aggressive, and it requires so much of their time, being a peer-reviewed process. And so I find that aptitude for long-term training, long-term capacity building, putting in that time is also something that will take us a few years, I think, in Afghanistan to start getting used to. And so that, I would say, would be a third problem that we've seen in the last 7 years in the journal writing process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam John. That was very illuminating. So interesting to hear about your experiences and all the wonderful work that that you do with DROPS. I want to come back to Dr. Namat now. What needs to be done to bring Afghan expertise to policymaking on Afghanistan when foreign countries and organizations are involved? What would your take there be, Dr. Namat?
Thank you. One example of things that needs to happen is living examples like the one that Mariam John has explained, to focus or to prioritize building skills among the Afghans themselves. I always challenge our international scholars or research consultants who are working with us and say, where are your Afghan versions? Have you trained or mentored someone? I try to pair, or to the extent possible to pair and make sure to facilitate such opportunities between senior scholars and Afghan research officers that we have at ARU, or even if beyond the organization, I try to sort of make this. I look at my own experience, personal experience of how I have reached where I have reached is, of course, a result of this mentorship guidance by those who are scholars and experienced researchers across the world with whom I've worked, with whom who have trained and educated me in many ways, and then as a result of a mutual exchange of me bringing the local knowledge and they give me the global standards of knowledge production process. I mean, it's a separate discussion what that process is and how that sort of also shapes people's thinking and views. But I think that really is one way that I wish to see replicated, and I wish to see more internationals working on Afghanistan, taking up these researchers and train them and mentor them, basically more than train them, because training in Afghanistan brings some memories that are not very favorable, because there is a misconception about learning research skills. We as ARU receive a lot of requests from a lot of institutions, even academic institutions. Can you come and provide us research methodology training? Those of you who are sort of experts on this conversation and listen to me, you will understand that research methodology is not about learning 2 + 2 = 4. There is a lot more involved, and that's a process that's you have to read enough to be able and confident. So that's that process requires a very fair attention, and it became a little bit of like a moral responsibility of any senior scholar, Afghan or international, working on a country like Afghanistan or elsewhere in a developing country, in a conflict-affected country, to make sure that there is also this responsibility that is not monetized. It's not about money and maybe it's about time as a resource, but not necessarily financial, to have those people mentored and guided. There is also a challenge that I have to say from the Afghan side. We should not sort of romanticize this in a way of saying that, oh, it's all the fault of the internationals, having interventionist approaches, or it's fault of the internationals, being extractive and all that. I think we in Afghanistan have also not probably worked in a more sort of serious level of building our skills. I have also come across in my over 10, 15 years of experience as a researcher, a lot of my very, very respected Afghan friends who hardly read a book in a month or in a couple of months, or even some of them probably they would listen to me saying that's maybe in a year they don't read a book or an article or something. It's more time speaking, and somehow Afghans are trained to be more oral in terms of speaking and being talkative than writing, and then focusing on reading and understanding. So that's requires a little bit of a cultural building, the culture of research and knowledge in the country. One way that we have seen working is to put a little more emphasis in ARU as an organization internationally known. For us, although we are a purely Afghan organization, but our first language is English because of ensuring the quality standards globally accepted. But we make sure to have equally high quality Dari and Pashto translation of our material to make sure that universities, professors, university students across the country have access to our resources, not only the policymakers, but also a wider community of our educational population have higher educational population have access to it. And that's really somehow expanded across the country, and I can say it has been quite warmly welcomed, although we haven't been able to distribute enough due to the COVID year, but we hope to do more. Another model or example I would like to share, although we ourselves are very new in it, but it has been quite warmly welcomed by a lot of people, is audiobooks. Basically turning the texts into audio, and specifically in countries like Afghanistan, where the level of knowledge in terms of the level of literacy is very low in terms of reading and writing. We are hoping that at least we can provide audiobooks to also make resources available to those who are able to listen to it and try to make it understandable. Because if overall knowledge is measured by going to schools and universities, all that, maybe the literacy level is very low in Afghanistan, but I have serious problems with those who will say that Afghans are uneducated, because I found men and women across the country extremely knowledgeable on many, many aspects of life, in many aspects of politics, without being able to read and write. They are strong listeners and speakers, and of course they do process issues probably in different ways than standard global ways, but they have a full access to knowledge of in their own ways. So making material available as much as possible to in ways, or tailoring it in ways that are receivable and understandable by larger population, is another way forward to ensure international partnership remains a critical aspect of this whole process. We at ARU are in this process, and we encourage also the rest of the research organizations in Afghanistan to seek such partnerships with established institutions, academic or research focused globally. That helps us in terms of exchanging experiences from Latin America to Asia to Europe to elsewhere to Africa. It will be quite amazing to have such kind of platforms created where we can have the opportunity of thematically discussing and bringing comparative forms of knowledge sharing between countries, south-south and north-south, or east-west, or whatever ways possible. This way we can sort of see some really lasting changes in approaches to what is happening now. And the desire is also to see, one final point, if I may add here, is to see also a more responsible approach from the government in terms of the higher education curriculums and the higher education methods of teaching. Our universities are really having the worst system of education probably in the region, if I'm not exaggerating, really. Theses are on sale, PowerPoint presentations are on sale, students can buy them. And the market, I know to an extent this is also an issue in Iran, but I think Afghanistan is a champion on this, unfortunately, with an extremely low level of knowledge skills on those topics and subjects as a result of bad teaching or bad curriculums in the universities. So we see some very slow changes, as I also mentioned earlier, but we would like to see more stronger reforms in the higher educational system so that the mechanisms of knowledge production, but also knowledge sharing is strengthened through the formal as well as the ways that I suggested through informal means of using audiobooks or using pictorial forms of information. We've recently started at ARU working on animation in one of our projects, and it was quite slowly welcomed by a number of audiences. We would like to spread it further and find these kind of more creative ways of sharing knowledge that could spreading knowledge that could attract people and sort of trigger some more motivations among the people to get more from the resources.
Thank you so much, Dr. Namad. We have a couple of questions from those of you who have tuned in. I want to start with Bashir. So a number of you mentioned the way in which resistance narratives have shaped jihad and current extremism by limiting discussions to skewed interpretations and views of Islam. Has there been any attempt by think tanks like AREU and academia to counter this and promote different views? Like I said, I would like to start just first with Bashir and then move on to Dr. Namad.
Unfortunately, the Afghan curriculum, if we talk about our bad experience with this jihadism and extremism, from if we go back to 1984, the academic environment, University of, if we name it, University of Nebraska Omaha, they developed our curriculum to glorify jihad, to glorify martyrdom, to dehumanize foreigners, and this curriculum was distributed to school children across Afghanistan and in refugee camps in Pakistan. So if that project lasted for 10 years, from 1984 to 94, and then obviously during the Mujahideen time and Taliban time, I personally studied the same curriculum that I learned to how to kill people, how to I mean the basic 1, 2, 3 was with guns, with knives, with so we for the past 2 decades we were systematically made to I mean the religion is totally misinterpreted in so for this recently we had a lot of developments in the curriculum. It's a big issue, and still if we see the violent extremism and radicalization, it's not it's not Afghan made. I mean, if you go to village, if you go to our traditional way of learning, the extremism, radicalization, it was a systematic back then. It's systematic now, and this is also a responsibility of the international community to make sure they do not fund I mean, sometimes they personalize political benefits, and they make the grounds fit for their political gains. They do this kind of activities and develop such kind of violent extremism. You can see that, but behind the scene, most of the extremism, most of the radicalization, they are developed overseas. They are developed by international actors just to gain their political benefits.
Thank you so much. Dr. Namad, I would like to ask you the same question.
Thank you, and thank you, Mayar-san, for your question in this regard. Building counter narratives require really different requires some level of attention to make sure that the counter narrative is not as extreme as the narrative itself, because then it will take us to completely different place. There has been efforts to work on peace buildings, for example. Probably that comes to my mind, at least to share. For example, I remember from my earlier experiences working on peace building for education, and this is a story sometimes I share about Nuristan, where we had a school and we were sending someone from Lagman to Nuristan who was a peace educator, to go and help the children in the school on peace building. In one of the topics in this excellent curriculum that was developed by an Afghan non-governmental organization, Sanai, was about anger management. So children at school learned about how to manage their anger. So they go home over lunches and dinners. They will, when their dad was shouting at them or something, they would say, take a deep breath, calm down, and things like this. So these men gathering in the mosque, or one and a couple of times, they try to have a conversation that is a little bit embarrassing to learn from our children. They came to me, I was leading a small grassroots organization at that time, and says, look, why are you wasting your time teaching children about these skills? Why don't you focus on us? We are the ones who are fighting. We are the ones who are angry. You teach the children about anger management. So I went back to them and I said, look, if it was not your children coming and telling you, you would never come all the way from Nuristan to Kabul to tell me that this is the case. So what I'm trying to say through this story is the fact that narratives are built on the basis of commitments to have for the country, for genuine commitments towards peace building. I think, unfortunately, what we are seeing now, and I hope those who in government will forgive me to say that, from both sides, Taliban are known for violence. Taliban without violence, I have difficulties understand what else could they do. Yes, classically speaking, of course, I have a clarity, because the pre-94 Talib was someone who would try to motivate us, try to educate people about religious values. But the politicized, the militarized Taliban, without violence, difficult to understand what could they do. So they have a challenge in front of them to come up with peaceful means of existence so that we can understand. But unfortunately, the government's mode of communications is full of, even to the top leadership level, is full of violence, anger, revenge. We have seen how the term revenge has been used again recently in a matter of a militia versus government fighting. This is not the sort of approach towards peace building. So a narrative, the responsibility to build counter narratives is not limited to a research organization and write down and say how we can go and depoliticize our values from the wartime. We are still at war situation, and it requires a genuine commitment to change the curriculums, to change the terminologies, and no longer use these kind of terms.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I'm so sorry to jump in. This was a great response. I just want to go to Mariam. Mariam Janis, you're still here with us. There is a question that I would like to ask you. How can the voices of Afghan civil society activists and scholars be enhanced in the Afghan peace process and in the area of knowledge production?
I'm sorry, there for a moment we had some electricity related issues.
I know, yeah. Okay, so let me repeat the question, okay? So how can the voices of Afghan civil society activists and scholars be enhanced in the Afghan peace process and in the area of knowledge production?
Well, I don't know what they mean necessarily by enhance, whether that means how can they reach the table or how they could be more inclusive. So I'm not quite sure what the question means in terms of the enhanced part. But what I would say is that in terms of the Afghan peace process, the think tank community and civil society organizations are already working on a number of initiatives. Youth roundtables are taking place around the country. Dialogues, theater, art. In terms of and the type of work that civil society is doing, because at AMUP we are mapping the work that is being done by civil society organizations on the ground. So we know when we need to be able to consolidate views. We know which organizations to approach, because we know the type of work they're engaging in this month, or I'm sorry, in the next quarter or so. So that work is already very much there. The only thing that's happening, which we need to be able to work on more, is coordinate these efforts a lot more. I think better coordination is required amongst the organizations that are doing a lot of this work. And here necessarily, some might say duplication is a bad thing. Why are you doing the same thing that another organization is doing? But the more we are engaging at the subnational level on the work in the peace process, the more I realize that you have a very vast population to cover. And so I don't see necessarily an issue in duplication of efforts when it brings in new participants. Hence, if we have better coordination among ourselves, then we can ensure that the initiatives or the consultations or the research that we're doing and that various organizations are doing is reaching or engaging the participation of as many diverse segments of the population as possible. In that context, I would say duplication is not problematic because we have a huge population to cover. Whenever anything goes to the peace table, both sides will give you their views. One side will say, well, the people that you consulted don't live under territory that's controlled by me, so hence it's not representative or it's not engaging. The other side will say the same thing, though you don't get it as often from that side. But even when you go deeper within the sectors, if it's women or if it's youth, you've got a lot of layers. So if you're looking at youth, you have youth in Kabul, you have youth as a subnational, you have youth in Taliban at the subnational level, and Taliban-controlled territories, outside of Taliban-controlled territories, right? So, and then in addition to that, you have youth in every single zone of the country. You have, in terms of breaking it down, and this goes for every sector, it's so wide. So I would just say at this particular moment, enhancing can be done if we have better coordination. Because right now, from the mapping that we're doing, there's an exhaustive list of work and activities that civil society is already engaged in.
Thank you so much, Mariam Jan. Thank you. I think we could have continued discussing this for hours, but we are out of time. This discussion has been a starting point. It is by no means final, and there are other perspectives. The purpose has been to initiate a conversation that puts Afghan voices at the front and center. And I think the insights that we've touched upon today amply show how important that is. It amply show that there is progress taking place. I want to thank our panelists for their participation. I also want to thank the Atlantic Council and the wonderful staff there for facilitating this important and critical discussion at this critical juncture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.